Hello everyone. As I start writing for this series, it is May the 27th, 2018. It was on this day in 1564 that John Calvin died. It has been, at the time of this writing, 454 years since his death. John Calvin is beloved by many and vilified by others. So is the case with the Apostle Paul. Both of these men poured themselves out in a work that they believed they were called to do, and when confronted by others to slow down so that they may live longer, they both pushed down harder on the pedal so that they would be found working until the end of their lives. No matter what one may think about either of these men, both should be emulated in the fact that they pushed themselves until the very end of their lives to fulfill the calling that they believed they had received. Many of us have been given a calling, but very, very few push themselves with such relentless determination to honor that calling. I myself hope to one day to ascend to such a level of pursuit to that which I have been called. I confess to my own shame that I have not reached such a height. Even during their lifetimes, both of them had their detractors. Both lived hard lives, and yet they both had a fondness and softness for those who were seeking the truth. Even in disagreement, they both sought reconciliation with those they disagreed with. They saw unity of the faith as paramount for an assembly to honor Yahweh in its midst. In April of 1564, John Calvin wrote in his testament, quote, "I give thanks to God that taking mercy on me, whom he had created and placed in this world, he not only delivered me out of the deep darkness of idolatry in which I was plunged, that he might bring me into the light of his gospel, and make me a partaker in the doctrine of salvation of which I was most unworthy, and not only kindly and graciously bore with my faults and my sins, for which, however, I deserved to be rejected by him and exterminated, but also vouchsafed me such clemency and kindness that he has used my assistance in preaching and promulgating the truth of his gospel." I think on these words as I write this to you all, realizing that I will be required to give an account before the great judge on the last day. That what I am about to speak, there will be no hiding from the one who has been appointed judge of the quick and the dead. And that if I am used at all in this discussion on the Apostle Paul, it is only by the greatest acts of mercy bestowed upon me by a most loving and gracious Heavenly Father. And that like Calvin, I give thanks to Yahweh who not only created me, but placed me in his creation. And seeing my miserable state, he delivered me from the darkest forms of idolatry and vilest sins. Should the Apostle Paul be with us today, he would have to declare that among sinners he was no longer the greatest, but that I had easily wrestled that title from him. I say none of this to denigrate myself before everyone, but to show that there is much for me to still overcome. I am not the most learned among humankind, and if by perchance I have mastered anything, it is ignorance. But truthfully, it should be said that I have been mastered by ignorance. The more I learn, the more I realize what I have to unlearn, and that the boundaries of my ignorance are shown to be without limit. I am not an expert on Paul or the Corinthian way of life, but I have applied myself, however weakly those attempts are, to learn somewhat about both. I owe a great debt to many in helping me come to the understanding of Paul that I hold to. There have been many and numerous pastors and teachers who have helped me form questions that cause me to search for answers. Just a few are Ben Witherington III in his commentary, Conflict and Community in Corinth, John MacArthur in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, J. Brian Tucker and his book, Reading 1 Corinthians, and the homilies of John Chrysostom. It is with great respect to all that will hear these words that I offer them. I consider all that I offer here will only be a rehearsal of things already known to all. But with that in mind, let us turn our attention to the Apostle Paul and meet in Corinth. As is well known, Corinth was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. It lay in ruins, with Greeks living at the edges of it, until Julius Caesar commanded it to be rebuilt in 44 BC, shortly before his death. With the command to rebuild also came Roman rule, Roman layout of the city, and Roman soldiers and freed persons to occupy it. The native Greeks remained, but they were not allowed to hold public office, although some of them were allowed to vote. The layout of the city has been compared to that of Pompeii, and by the time Paul arrived in Corinth, it had become one of the more prosperous cities in Roman territory. Having to rebuild the city provided an opportunity for people, both free and slaves, to promote themselves as having restored the city to a glorious state. Public perception was much more important than the truth in Corinth because it was such an honor-shame-driven society. And due to its location, there was a path constructed through the isthmus by which boats were pulled across to avoid the dangerous trek around it. Concerning the geography of Corinth, Strabo wrote, "Corinth is called wealthy due to its commerce, since it is located on the isthmus and is the master of two harbors, one of which leads directly to Asia and the other to Italy. The exchange of merchandise from both distant countries is made easier by the city's location. And, just as in early times, the seas around Sicily are not easy to navigate." That is Geography 8, 6, and 20. Ben Witherington writes in his commentary, quote, "Corinth was thus the central crossroads for Mediterranean trade going east and west, and to a lesser degree for goods shipped from Egypt or elsewhere in northern Africa to points north of Corinth. For ships going east to west or west to east, it was far easier and safer not to make the 6-day journey south around Greece, but to unload at one of Corinth's two ports and have the goods carried up to the other port, where they could be reloaded onto another ship, or onto the same ship if it was small enough to be dragged across the isthmus on a road built especially for that purpose." End of quote. Corinth was also home to the Isthmian Games, and second only in prestige to the Olympic Games in Rome. And these games were held every 2 years. But every 4 years, the Imperial and Caesarean Games were held in Corinth. Outside of the sports-styled games played, there were also oratory and musical games. And it seems that shortly after Paul left Corinth, none other than Nero competed in the musical games. Women also competed in the games. Corinth was the capital city of the Achaia region, not Athens, which meant that the city answered to Rome. It was into this world that the apostle entered when he came to Corinth. This background also affected the way in which he wrote to them. And referring back to the games, especially the oratory ones, it is not surprising that they were held in Corinth. Rhetoric, the art of persuasion, was widely used in the Roman Empire and flourished in cities like Corinth. There are 3 types of rhetoric. They are deliberative, which is used in an assembly when the body is determining which course to take. Forensic was used in the courts of law, and epidactic was used during funeral services or in public speeches when someone was being applauded or disapproved of. During this time frame, not only was substance a great matter, but also how one presented their argument. There also came one other form of rhetoric, and that was declamation. Declamation was an exercise on hypothetical situations and frivolous topics. Declamation and epidactic forms were put together and used by sophists. Sophists were known as teachers of moral skepticism and specious reasoning. Specious meaning the argument was superficially plausible but still incorrect. Into this contest steps our apostle. You have heard it said that some people were born for a moment in time, and truer words could not be spoken about the Apostle Paul. Paul, also born Saul of Tarsus, was a man of three worlds. He was born a Roman citizen. He was born in Asia Minor, the city of Tarsus, which was one of the Hellenistic centers of that time, which made him of Greek heritage, and he was born of the tribe of Benjamin. He was also a student of Gamaliel, as he was sent to Jerusalem at some point in his life. Paul, from a young age, was probably introduced to rhetoric. As a matter of fact, over half of Gamaliel's students were trained in Sophia, or wisdom, of the Greeks. And being a Pharisee, he would have studied greatly in the art of persuasion, as Pharisaism grew through proselytization. This meant that Paul would have been very familiar with Koine Greek and the use of reasoning and argumentation. Now, with our background finally set, let us enter the arena with our apostle, a man who can move freely through the Roman Empire thanks to his citizenship, a man who was birthed in the center of a Hellenistic culture and then was fine-tuned by one of the greatest rabbis of all time, Gamaliel. A man so zealous for the Torah that it took the great King of Kings to unseat him from his horse. After answering the call of Messiah, he now also is Holy Spirit infused and steps into the arena, not just against some of the best rhetoricians of his time, but against some of the greatest of all time. He did not enter the arena for one-on-one combat, but one against a team. And, just like most of us, he found his greatest battles occurred against those who he considered family. Let us see how our apostle handles this. Beginning in chapter 8 and verses 1 of 1 Corinthians. Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves Elohim, this one is known by him. Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other Elohim but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one Elohim, the Father, of whom are all things, and we for him, and one Master, Yeshua the Messiah, through whom are all things, and through whom we live. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge, for some with consciousness of the idol, until now eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. But food does not commend us to Elohim, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. But beware, lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge, eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Messiah died? But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Messiah. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Unfortunately for us, we only have one side of this conversation. And I believe that if we had the letter from the Corinthians and the message that the household of Chloe brought to the Apostle Paul that brought this response, we would all be better able to understand what is going on. But we work with what we have in hand. The beginning statement of chapter 8 informs us that we are talking about idols. An idol is an image made by human hands to represent a deity. The next statement we have is, quote, we know that we all have knowledge. What we have here is Paul quoting something back to them from the letter they wrote unto him. This part could be more correctly put as, we know that, quote, we all have knowledge. This begins a section in which the word know and knowledge show up multiple times in a short space. The first know is different from the rest. It is Strong's number 1492, edu, which means to know, be aware, perceive, and see, among others. The strange thing about this word is that it is to be compared with another word, and that word being Strong's number 3700, optanomahi, which comes from optimahi. When you find the comparison to edu, you find that optanomahi differs from edu because edu, quote, expresses merely mechanical, passive, or casual vision. So what does optanomahi and optimahi mean? They are defined as, quote, as an alternate of 3708, to gaze, that is, with wide open eyes, as at something remarkable. Number 3708, horao, means, quote, to discern clearly, physically or mentally, by extension, to attend to. In Hebraic thought, it means to experience, and passively, to appear, behold, perceive, take heed. What Paul is saying to the Corinthians is that, quote, we all have knowledge, is a blanket statement. It is merely casual observation that allows one to say such a thing. That would be like me saying to all of us that we all know that each of us has knowledge. The statement in itself is true, but only in the most general way. For we all know that none of us know the same things as each other, and that we don't know the same things about the same thing. All of us have knowledge, but we all have knowledge about different things, and there are even differences in what we may know concerning the same subject. I hope you was able to stay with that. This is the first thing that our apostle must deal with, blanket statements to excuse behavior. What he is saying to the Corinthians is that what I am about to quote from you is a blanket statement that is not valid. The quote being, we all have knowledge. The word knowledge is Strong's number 1108 and is the word gnosis, which means knowledge or science. Yes, all the Corinthians had knowledge or gnosis, but they were not all operating on the same level. Then Paul says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. The definite article ho is in the Greek before gnosis, meaning this knowledge or this kind of knowledge makes one arrogant. Now, we're getting a good look at what is happening. Some Corinthians believe that since everyone has knowledge, that they are able to do some things. And obviously, these things are causing some issues, and that some are not being built up in their faith. This may even be referencing that the people Paul is dealing with are Gnostic in their faith. But more on this a little later. Verse 2 could read as follows. If anyone thinks he knows anything, I speak of the most basic way of knowing anything. He is not yet known. I now speak of knowing in an absolute manner that allows one to be sure in their understanding, as it is necessary to know, in an absolute manner that allows one to be sure in their understanding. Paul is slamming his intended audience using epidetic rhetoric. He is saying that these in-the-know believers may have casual knowledge of a thing, but they do not have a complete understanding of what they are talking about. They are missing some vital understanding, whether it comes from Scripture or by experience. Because of this incomplete knowledge and their hardiness, they are not building up the assembly by their actions. Verse 3 says, but if anyone loves Elohim, this one is known. I speak of a complete knowing by him or by the Father. For true love puts the Father and one in a relationship in such a way that the Father knows you in a most absolute and intimate way. For if you love the Father and build up His people, then He knows you in a most intimate way. The Father is not far from you. He is drawn near to you because you are drawing His people near to Him through love. And so now we will get to the meat of the argument. What is it that these certain Corinthians know that the others do not? Let us see how Paul quotes them starting in verse 4. Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other Elohim but one. Paul then goes on to write, for even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one Father, of whom are all things, and we for Him, and one Master, Yeshua the Messiah, through whom are all things, and through whom we live. The Corinthians are saying that because they know absolutely that an idol is nothing, and that because they are absolutely sure that there is no other Elohim other than Yahweh, it is okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Paul addresses the second argument first in this case. He is saying, wait a minute, there are many gods and lords, but we believe that there is only one mighty one, who is the Father from whom all things come, and we are for Him, and that there is one Master, Yeshua the Messiah, through whom all things came to be, and through whom we live. Paul tells them that there are other mighty ones and masters. Yes, Yahweh is above all, and nothing happens without His knowing, but there are still other beings. Some say that Paul is referring to humans as being gods and lords. And while Scripture does state that men have been called mighty ones, even by Yahweh, I don't believe Paul is referencing that Scripture. I believe he is talking about demons, and we will look at this in just a moment. Continuing in verse 7, Paul writes, however, there is not in everyone that knowledge, for some, with consciousness of the idol, until now eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. But food does not commend us to Elohim, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worst. What knowledge is it that not everyone has? It is the knowledge that some Corinthians said in verse 1 that all have. That knowledge being that an idol is nothing in this world. Paul is saying, though, that some people's moral conscience does not allow them to eat food offered to an idol because they still believe there is something to the idol, and that by the actions of those in the know, those whom they consider weak were being defiled in their moral conscience. These weak brethren had either by ritual or some other happening an experience that left them with some knowledge concerning idols, which kept them from desiring to eat food sacrificed to idols. Paul is not calling those people weak. He is merely using the term used by we who have knowledge. Next, Paul deals with what food does and doesn't do. He states that food does not commend us to Elohim. There is nothing about food that can make us better in the eyes of Yahweh. If there had been anything that food could have done for us in making us pleasing to Yahweh, then He would not have had to send His Son in the form of sinful flesh. He could have spared Yeshua a lot of discomfort, pain, and death. These in-the-know Corinthians believed they were better off with Yahweh because they can eat an offering made to an idol in front of it, whereas those who couldn't do this were considered worse off to Yahweh and therefore weak. Paul is saying that they are wrong in believing this. But let us stop and ask ourselves something. What kind of believer would believe this? What could possibly be in their background? Ben Witherington III writes, "It may be that those in the know had been influenced by Epicurean ideas." He's referencing Stour's Paul on the Use from page 277. He continues writing, "When new converts entered the Epicurean community, they were first instructed to give up traditional false beliefs and superstitions about the gods, and then taught true knowledge based on reason. Epicureans were allowed, and indeed even encouraged, to worship the traditional Greek gods as long as they did not involve themselves in this world and recognized that rituals had no effect. Some of the Corinthians were very proud of their true beliefs about the divine and the powers of those beliefs to desacralize the world. Perhaps some Corinthians had read Paul's monotheistic teaching, referencing chapter 8 and verse 6, through Epicurean glasses." What we have here are believers who, upon grasping the teaching concerning Yahweh the Father and His Son, then passed it through the lens of their former Epicurean beliefs. They now know who the true Mighty One is, and since He is one, then they can eat meat offered to idols without it bothering them. They may have been stoic or cynic before coming to the faith. If this is the case, then they believe that they would have been the ideal man and therefore possess power that gave them the right to claim that everything was permitted to them because of their freedom. More on this "everything is permitted to me" later. But notice again, if you will, the first sentence from the quotation above from Ben Witherington III. Quote, "When new converts entered the Epicurean community, they were first instructed to give up traditional false beliefs and superstitions about the gods, and then taught true knowledge based on reason." These in-the-know believers were still applying their former Epicurean beliefs as it pertained to idols. Paul deals with this form of Epicurean reasoning in verse 5, which states, "For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords." Notice what Paul says. He says that there are many gods and lords. Who exactly are these gods and lords? They are demons. Paul is telling them that they cannot say truthfully that there are not supernatural beings on this planet. Without quoting certain scriptures, he could very well be referencing Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and beginning in verse 17, which states, "They sacrificed to demons, not to Elohim, to gods they did not know, to new gods, new arrivals that your fathers did not fear." And again, in Leviticus chapter 17 and beginning in verse 1, we read, "And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron, to his sons, and to all the children of Israel, and say to them, This is the thing which Yahweh has commanded, saying, Whatever man of the house of Israel who kills an ox or lamb or goat in the camp, or who kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, to offer an offering to Yahweh before the tabernacle of Yahweh, the guilt of bloodshed shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people, to the end that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices, which they offer in the open field, that they may bring them to Yahweh at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, to the priests, and offer them as peace offerings to Yahweh. And the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of Yahweh at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and burn the fat for a sweet aroma to Yahweh. They shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons, after whom they have played the harlot. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout their generations." There are other powers that move on this planet, and they are desirous to steal the worship of Yahweh whenever and wherever they can. These in-the-know Corinthians had reasoned that since Yahweh is one, that there could not be anything else, or that if other powers existed, they were unable to do anything because of Yahweh. So therefore, it was okay to eat in a temple food that had been sacrificed to an idol. What Paul is saying is that there is a power behind the idols. While an idol in itself is nothing, there is something that has attached itself to it. The idol is also in a house that was built for it. This is where the devotees to this god go to worship the deity. Quoting Ben Winnington III in his commentary writes, "Several temples in Corinth had dining rooms where feasts were held on many occasions, including birthdays. Temples were the restaurants of antiquity. There is archaeological evidence at the Asclepion in Corinth of a dining room with couches along the four walls and a table and brazier in the center." End of quote. We see that temples were a big part of social life in Corinth. A former Epicurean turned follower of Yeshua would not have had a problem walking into a temple and partaking of the meal. They probably would have even given thanks for the food as if it came from the deity, not believing that there was a deity to begin with. A former Stoic or Cynic, bringing their former beliefs into the assembly, would not have had an issue either. They had finally become the ideal man, so there would not have been anything that they could not participate in or do. And these former Gnostics were also probably the movers and shakers in the Corinthian community. They were probably patrons of the community, thereby having quite a few stones around with their achievements on them. They would have been very active in getting ahead in the community and were used to receiving invites to such functions. What we have here are people who have come to know the Messiah, and yet they are still Corinthian at heart. There is nothing new under the sun, so this should not come as a surprise to anyone. And most believers, whether they are Christian, Messianic, or any other label, have given mental assent to the need for a Savior and claim Him. Yet they live with the same heart foundations they had before knowing Messiah. Turning our attention to the last few verses of chapter 8, Paul writes this, starting in verse 9, "But beware, lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Messiah died? But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Messiah. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." Verse 9 lets us know that liberty is the issue. The "I know the truth so I can do what I want" attitude that affects the body of Messiah and society today was in full force in Corinth. They have put themselves forward as those who have knowledge, and by their eating they are taunting other believers to eat with them. Some of those who are being taunted may have been former Epicureans, Stoics, Cynics, or former followers of that deity who had determined to put their past lifestyle behind them. While they still would have known their former beliefs, they would not trust their former knowledge, relying strictly on the teachings of the apostles Paul and of course of Apollos and even Peter. Those who have been followers of the deity would not want to participate because of an experience that they may have had. And yet again others may have been poor, who had very few options in attending such feasts, and would not attend due to the honor that was expected to be paid to the deity providing for the meal. Especially for the poor, this may have been a great issue. They would not have had the chance to eat meat often, and the one furnishing the feast in his God's name would have expected the poor to pay homage to his deity. For remember, Corinth was an honor-shame-driven community. The one holding this feast would be considered to be your patron, your provider. Looking to another human this way would have been the same as worshiping the idol itself. Paul is telling these who have knowledge that they should not be in temples eating food dedicated to an idol because it is causing others to stumble in their faith. Paul then shames them by stating that if eating meat at all offended a brother, he would not eat it. It wouldn't matter where or how it came to be on the table. So when we cause believers to stumble in their faith because of our liberty, we are sinning against the Messiah also. So, we may be looking at a class distinction between those who have climbed the Corinthian ladder and those who have not. This term weak could have been in reference to the poor. What we may have then is that those who have knowledge are well off, and they are unwilling to humble themselves for the Ebionites in the community. The Jewish Ebionites were known for bringing non-Jews into the group by way of the Noahide laws and by the use of the ruling of the Jerusalem Council. Ebionites also did not eat any meat. They were strictly vegetarian. So this may be the reason for Paul's blanket statement about not eating meat. So, while it cannot be proven, we may have Paul here speaking in defense of a small Ebionite community. And we'll get ready to move on to chapter 10 and beginning in verse 6. Sorry, getting dry. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters as some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Messiah as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages have come. Following Paul's train of thought, we see that lust leads to idolatry, and that idolatry leads to sexual immorality. The first is a reference to the children of Israel while they were waiting for Moses to come down the mountain. The second reference is that of the sin of Balaam, which he caused the children of Israel to fall into. Worship was tied to sexual practices for most, if not all, temples during this time. People have wondered if temple prostitution was still happening in Corinth at the time of Paul's writing this. What most do agree on is that there were temple escorts for parties. These escorts were for play after the dinner, and they may have actually put on a play before those attending, with even the attendees participating. Paul then lists other examples for the Corinthians to not follow. They are tempting the Messiah and complaining. Notice verse 11. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages have come. If the examples or types were punished justly for their actions, then how much more sore punishment should we expect if we follow them in their destructive ways? Now into verse 14. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Messiah? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Messiah? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to Elohim, and I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the master and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the master's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the master to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? I want you to notice how Paul refers to the Corinthians even after calling their knowledge into question. He calls them wise men and seeks their judgment on what he is about to say. Paul is going to use the forensic style of rhetoric, the style of rhetoric that was used in a court of law. He starts with the master's table, asking them to judge if they were one body because they all partook of the same bread. By partaking of Yeshua through communion, we become one in him. He, then being one body and not divided, makes us one in him. This speaks to unity of all through a divine meal, in this case, communion. He then moves to Israel after the flesh. Those who eat the sacrifice are partakers of the altar. What is special about the altar? If you look at Exodus chapter 30 and beginning in verse 25, you'll read, "And you shall make from these a holy anointing oil, an ointment compounded according to the art of the perfumer. It shall be a holy anointing oil. With it you shall anoint the tabernacle of meeting and the ark of the testimony, the table and all its utensils, the lampstand and its utensils, and the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering with all its utensils, and the laver and its base. And you shall consecrate them, that they may be most holy. Whatever touches them must be holy. And you shall anoint Aaron and his sons, and consecrate them, that they may minister to me as priests." What the children of Israel partake of is holiness from Yahweh. Everything that touched the altar became holy, and the only people that could touch the altar were the priests. But the offering also touched the altar. And then Yahweh let the people participate in a fellowship meal with him. It is in this participation of the meal they partook of the holiness, thereby they themselves became holy space for Yahweh. He then brings it down to the point that what the Gentiles offer, they offer to demons. And here we have Paul saying that offering food to idols is sacrificing to demons. So, if you partake of communion and you partake of Yeshua and thereby have fellowship with him, and when the children of Israel partake of the altar, they partake of holiness and have fellowship with Yahweh, then when you partake of a meat sacrifice in a temple, then you are in fellowship with that demon. The Corinthians knew the first two parts were right, so therefore the last point had to be right. Like the old saying goes, if you say A, you have to say B. If you say B, then you have to say C. The point of this saying is that you cannot jump around and say just anything. Reasoned arguments should follow a logical progression. Paul was just following proper forensic rhetoric principles. The last point of this section being that you cannot be in fellowship with Yeshua and demons at the same time. Only one of them can be your provider. And this takes us into the last section for today. In verse 23 we read, "All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being." What we have here is a response from Paul concerning either a letter from the Corinthians or to what Paul was told from those of the household of Chloe. Those of us who have knowledge, are saying to Paul that all things are lawful for them. Remember, this comes from the Stoic and Cynic forms of Gnostic teaching. And obviously by Paul quoting it twice, they must have written it concerning at least two matters. They say, "All things are lawful for me." Paul replies, "But not all things are helpful." They come back again and say, "All things are lawful for me." Paul replies, "But not all things edify." While I was working at General Electric, they had us take communication classes. And the best way to ensure that nothing is being misunderstood is by quoting back what you heard. Paul quotes them twice and provides his response. He then finishes with his admonition to seek the welfare of others over oneself. In verse 25, "Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake, for the earth is Yahweh's and all its fullness. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner, and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, 'This was offered to idols,' do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake, for the earth is Yahweh's and all its fullness." Let's start in verse 25. "Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake, for the earth is Yahweh's and all its fullness." The meat market is an interesting expression. Corinth, like many other cities, had a meat market. This is where some items that may have been offered to idols have been brought to be sold for regular consumption. Also at these meat markets, there were fish, vegetables, and fruit. That's correct. It is more like a real market instead of just a meat market. There were plenty of items there that may not have been offered to idols. Some of the sellers had live animals that could be bought alive or even butchered there. They had stone slabs to keep items cool. They had running water and troughs to catch blood from animals and fish. Some people bought items from others and sold them there. They may have not had an idea if an animal had been dedicated to a god. Paul is saying that if you're going to the grocery store, you don't have to check and find out if that animal had been dedicated to a god, because you're bringing that animal or that meat, that fish, or those vegetables or those fruit to your home. You're not in front of an idol in a temple dedicated to it, eating food that has been offered to it. Notice the big distinction that Paul makes between buying something and bringing it home, and if you're sitting in a temple eating meat, or food for that matter, offered to the deity of that temple. There are some things in Scripture we cannot perfectly relate to. However, there are some things that we can compare today's lifestyle to that of those in the first century. So you go to the grocery store. Do you find someone and ask if anything has been offered to a deity? Do you ask about every item? If no, then why not? I have over 2 decades in food service. I have handled a lot of different food items that humanity has stuffed in its mouth. I have seen boxes come in with "Approved of Allah." I have seen boxes come in with dedications to Poseidon. I have seen boxes come in with "Blessed by Lord Shiva." You know, that's the Hindu god that is portrayed as half man and half woman at times. One of these things that they all shared was that the writing was on the boxes. They were not anywhere on the packaging of the product itself. The first item I spoke concerning, "Approved of Allah," was meat. The second, of course, concerning Poseidon, concerned seafood. And the third, the "Blessed by Lord Shiva," was a vegan, non-GMO hummus. There is no way that anyone working can keep track of every little thing written on a box when you are trying to fill the shelves. Having come to this knowledge through visual experience, there is also something else to be considered. There's no way of knowing if someone has dedicated the work of their hands to any deity. If they get up and pray to some deity to bless them and the work that they do, then those items are offered to that deity. It may be that they bottle water, make soap, they may work in a restaurant, they may also work in a deli. As a matter of fact, there were also delis in the meat market, just so you could try different items from other locales, just like our delis today. These people may offer up the work of their hands in the auto industry, the financial sector, and remember, these are the ones securing your retirement. Or maybe they do work as a butcher or some other food service position. What I'm getting at is that the markets of Corinth are no different than the markets of this or any other country. Idolatry abounds everywhere. And what I'm about to say next is so important. Whatever you buy, you bring to your home, and you, in your house, give thanks for what Yahweh has provided and pray His blessings over it. For the earth and all its fullness belongs to Yahweh. The food items that Yahweh has declared clean are clean. What all this boils down to is that no one, not even those in Corinth, could ever be sure about anything. Remember, the isthmus they were on brought goods from every country. And Israel was to be a nation that covered the earth with the knowledge of Yahweh. But we all know that this has never happened. Throughout my working career, I've worked beside those of many, many different beliefs, including a practicing Satanist. They all prayed to their God for help and for blessings on what they were going to do that day. And those in Corinth could never truly know to whom, if anyone, any item had been dedicated to, just like us today. There is no telling how many deities have been prayed to by auto workers as they were making your vehicle. But after you purchase the vehicle and bring it home, you can then pray over it, offering it to Yahweh for His glory and for His blessings. Now the item is yours at your dwelling place, which hopefully you have prayed to Yahweh concerning it. Just like the food issue at Corinth, buy it and bring it home. Pray to Yahweh concerning it, and He will bless it. Notice what Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verses 1 through 5. Quote, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from foods which Elohim created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For every creature of Elohim is good, and nothing is to be refused if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of Elohim and prayer." So, the next time you go to the store and buy some items and bring them home, you need to pray over them. For if they have been declared clean by the word of Yahweh, and you pray and give thanks, then the food should be enjoyed as a gift from a loving Father. Because you do not know who offered those items to a deity by just asking for the works of their hands to be blessed by their God. This includes those stocking the shelves who pray that the items sell so they do not have to throw it away, or just so they can get a bonus. So now you say, okay, I'll grow my own food, raise my own animals. The land you use may have been offered to some deity by a native of the land long before anyone settled it. So you're still back to square one. The water you give your animals or plants to drink may have had its fountainhead dedicated to a deity by a native of the land. All of this you may not be able to prove, and even if you could, you still cannot undo the past. The act itself has been done. Well, what you can do is you can pray over the water and your land to secure Yahweh's blessings. But in the end, that is no different than praying over the food. Even the seed you sow comes from a source somewhere, even if you're using GMO items. So now again you'll say, I only eat kosher food. Okay, that's all well and good, except for the Apostle John. In 1 John chapter 2 and 23 he writes, quote, no one who denies the Son has the Father. He who confesses the Son has the Father as well. Rabbinic Judaism denies Yeshua as the Son of Yahweh. And when you think about it, every religion denies Yeshua. That denial means they do not have the Father also, and that whatever they do, unfortunately, it is an offering of their life force to some other God. So what Paul and I are getting at is that every good and perfect gift has come down from the Father. Thank Him for it. Ask for His blessings upon it to strengthen and heal you so that you may live a life that glorifies Him. You cannot do anything about the source of the food except to make sure it is biblically kosher. So don't needlessly worry over it. In verse 27, if any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, for conscience sake. For the earth is Yahweh's in all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. Now to a third situation well known in Corinth. This is being invited over for dinner. Paul is saying, look, you're invited to a dinner and go. When you get there, you don't ask questions for your moral conscience. Instead, give thanks for what you're given and enjoy it. But if they say that the food was offered to some deity, you then refuse the food. And you refuse based on the earth is Yahweh's and all its fullness. For you see, the host obviously believes otherwise. And what you are doing by refusing is making a moral judgment, which will affect the moral consciousness of the host, because you have refused to eat food they offered to some god. But why not ask? Because you're not in a temple. You're at someone's house. There is a huge difference between a temple dedicated to a god and being at someone's house. There was another reason for turning down food offered to a deity. If food was offered to a god being served, there was also a good chance that escorts would be showing up later to keep the party going. This also involved a lot of drinking. Most of these parties were male-only affairs, and some had young boys as attendants at the parties. They would do all the serving and then be kept around for later. Just like today, your neighbor can invite you over for burgers. You can also be invited over only to find out it is a party dedicated to Baphomet. You go over and find out it is a Baphomet night, and then you excuse yourself from the festivities. Verse 29, for why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? These are questions from those in the know. Paul is giving their arguments, and he can do so by the letter they wrote him and from the information from Chloe's household. Remember, the Corinthians were all about their liberty in Messiah. They even speak of giving thanks at these gatherings. So what is the problem? When you are at home, you are the master. When you are at someone else's home, you are a guest. Everyone knows what they have gathered for, and if the meal has been dedicated to a god, they know to whom everyone gives thanks to. Their liberty is not being judged by saying no. They are showing their liberty by saying no. By saying no, what they are saying is that they only owe thanks to Yahweh. We understand from these questions that these are the knowing ones, and quite possibly they are well off financially. It would have been a rare occasion for the poor to have been invited to such a party, and if they stayed for the food, they would have been expected to give thanks not just to the master of the house, but also the God to whom the food was dedicated. The poor did not eat much meat. They could not afford it. So if they got invited to a dinner, it was a luxury. The same was true at the meat market. The poor occasionally were able to buy fish, but it was the rare occasion that they could afford meat. Verse 31. Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of Elohim. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of Elohim, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Paul answers their questions. In everything we do, it should be done to glorify Yahweh. Eating meat, or any food for that matter, that is knowingly sacrificed to idols, honors the demons behind those idols. Going to a party in which the food is knowingly dedicated to a god is giving thanks to that god. And therein lies the rub. If we don't know anything about the food that we partake of, then we can, with unfeigned thanks, give honor and thanks to Yahweh for providing it. Just like in Corinth, and in this time that we live in, you cannot be sure that the food you are partaking of has at some point been dedicated to another god. All the person must do is ask their God to bless the work of my hands, or say, all I'll do today I dedicate to your honor and glory, to some other deity. So, when it comes to matters of food, we should not become a stumbling block to those of our faith and those of other faiths. If putting a piece of cheese on a burger offends someone, then I don't need to put that cheese on there. Just because I know it is okay does not make it okay. There are more important things than our rights. And one of those things are our responsibilities. Every true believer is to act in such a way that Yahweh and Yeshua are glorified. We give up our rights when we want to imitate Yeshua. He gave up his rights as the only begotten of Yahweh to come to this earth. He gave up his right to make decisions for himself by submitting his will to that of the Father. And by becoming so rights stripped, he has been able to draw many to himself since he was lifted up on that cross. We obediently strip away our rights, not so that we may profit from our actions, but so others, upon seeing us as having taken the role of slaves unto the great slave, will profit by salvation through that same great slave who is now the one seated at the right hand of the Majesty on high. I said earlier that I work with a Satanist. We worked together off and on for close to 2 years. And on his last day I stopped by to see him and say goodbye. As we started talking, he said that he was glad that I came by and that he wanted me to know something. He said, quote, "The only time I know peace is when you're around." When we worked together, I never used my rights as a child of the highest. When he wanted to talk about things, we talked, and I didn't judge him based on what he would say. And ever since that day, I prayed that not only would he know the kind of peace he had when around me, but that he would come to know the Prince of that peace. And in case you were wondering, I did not know any form of peace when we were together. There was always this battle inside of me, but I refused to let it show. There is a statement which goes like, there are things more important than me. And that statement does not speak to the whole truth of the matter. The truth is stated more closely as, all people are more important than me. That statement was never more walked out than when Yeshua voluntarily stripped himself at the throne of heaven and then allowed others to strip and beat him. The suffering and humiliation only ending when he breathed his last breath so that we humans could breathe in the breath of life once more. And this is Paul's concluding challenge to those in the know in Corinth and to those of us who think we know more and know better. The challenge being put in a question as, can you set aside your knowledge to show the love of the one who knows all things? And for many of us, the answer is sadly enough, no. We have worked too hard to give up our knowledge for the salvation of another. They, the less knowing, need to come up here. And this, brothers and sisters, is a Corinthian attitude. Paul, in this section to the Corinthians, is dealing with three situations. The first, eating meat sacrificed to idols in a temple. Paul says, no, don't do it. The knowing Corinthians did not understand that there were entities receiving worship by their actions, and it was also providing a stumbling block to others in the assembly. The second, the purchase of food in the meat market. There was no way of knowing if any food purchased in the court had been offered to idols. Any seller could tell you that it had not been sacrificed to a god just to make the sale. The seller may not even know if they had acquired the item from someone else. So, you purchase the food, you bring it home, pray over it, giving thanks and blessing unto Yahweh for it. And it was understood in those days that when one entered a temple, they were entering the domain of the deity to which the temple was dedicated. The same can be said for a house or an apartment today. Walking into a temple was the same as turning your back on Yahweh. Now, walking into your house, if you have dedicated it to Yahweh, is turning your back on the gods of this world. That is why you can bring in food that is acceptable to Yahweh, pray over it, and no longer worry about its origins. Thirdly, should you get invited to a dinner party by a person who is a non-believer, it is okay to go. There is nothing wrong with burger, brews, and a Braves-Blue Jays doubleheader. However, if you are asked to go and they tell you it's going to be burgers, brews, badminton, and a Baphomet after party, you should decline. Why would they tell you up front? Because you would be expected to stay for the dinner and the festivities afterward to pay homage. They would be wanting your approval for their actions. And if they tell you during badminton, you can still excuse yourself. By doing this, you will be affecting their moral conscience. Does any of this affect the fact that you ate? No. It is not any different than if, after badminton, they wished you a safe trip home and then started the Baphomet affair after you left without telling you it was going to happen. And if they tell you why eating, just quit eating. By doing so, you are showing that you have chosen to worship the only true and living Creator of all things. It is them that are being judged by your actions. You show your freedom by saying no. At the end of the day, all we can do is be responsible for our own actions. That includes the times when we can say yes and the times when we have to say no. One last thing, Paul is dealing with those who have knowledge versus those considered weak by the knowing ones. There were many problems in Corinth long before Paul ever got there. A city built on self-promotion is a city that has a faulty foundation. There will always be those who build their reputation on the backs of others just to get ahead. One of the main things that the faith once delivered was to put all people on equal footing in the body of Messiah. And this flew in the face of Roman society and Corinthian beliefs. For many, to be considered the equal of their house slave was difficult to deal with at best. But no one is saved by their own actions. All the saved have been saved by grace through faith, which is not of ourselves, but being a gift from the Father above. And in a society that favors those who pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, this good news calls for a completely different type of lifestyle. It is a life of humble obedience, not I can do this on my own. Paul is explaining to those who are in the know that knowledge is nothing without the love of Messiah being expressed to those of a like precious faith. At no time were they to look down on those less fortunate than themselves. And even in knowing something, one may not know everything, including the most important parts about what they need to know. And that even though eating is a part of how one lives in relationship to others is even more important. So, if you pass up a steak so that another believer is not bothered and you can grow through fellowship with him, you have chosen wisely. If you choose to sit with another believer and make no mention of the fact that you don't eat meat just so you can grow in faith with them, then you have chosen wisely. Eating biblically approved foods does not affect our salvation, nor does it make one more holy than another. By this I mean that one can have a biblically approved diet and still refuse to recognize Yeshua for the Messiah that he is and still be damned. But how we approach relationships based on food can have a great impact on whether or not one enters the kingdom of heaven. So, when given the choice to love our fellow believer or to engage our rights, we must always choose to love. Above all else that, Paul is saying, this is the most important message. And that is why chapters 12 and 13 are soon to follow. It is my hope that what I have said here today has been well reasoned and objective. We are told to be able to defend what we believe in. Hopefully, I have done so in a manner that can be understood. Not that there is any lack on anyone else's part, but if it has not come across, then it is because I have not been able to properly articulate what I hold to be true. I have not put any of this forth to change anyone's mind, but to hopefully engage with those who disagree with me in a loving and thoughtful way. As it says, come and let us reason together. Just in case you're wondering what's coming up, we will be staying in Corinth for a little bit, but no worries. We will walk the dusty roads to other places, and we will sail the seas to keep track of our intrepid apostle. Please feel free to comment below. But remember, be kind, tender-hearted to each other, showing honor and love to all. But let it be known, if you decide to fight, I'll circumcise your comment. Yes, we will even touch that most cutting subject of all. Maybe we can even start to figure out what is going on between Paul and the Ebionites. One thing we do know is that history will give up its secrets. We just have to keep digging. And until next time, I wish you all peace and love in the Messiah. I'm out of here.